Linda Dahl first approached me about speaking on the theme of courage and asked me to link it to an experience that my wife Becky and I had back in 1964 in the arena of civil rights. In fact, Linda is the genius behind this whole service. She's done everything except write my sermon. I want to begin by honing in on what some people call moral courage. That is, courage that's linked to one's strongly held convictions, beliefs, or morals. Or as a phrase we all know puts it, having the courage of our convictions. My moral compass was firmly established in the early 1960s by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Although I never met him in person, only on the TV screen and on the printed page, he was and remains the greatest single influence in my professional and personal life. Not the only one, but certainly the most influential. His influence was undergirded by many of my biblical and theological studies in seminary, especially the prophetic tradition and Hebrew scriptures, and certain of the teachings of Jesus, which together contributed to what we call the social gospel, with its emphasis on peace, justice, and love in this world. I graduated from seminary in 1964 and took my first job as a staff member of a Presbyterian church near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Let me remind you what was going on in Mississippi in 1964. Probably that for which the summer is most remembered. In the June of that year was the murder of 3 civil rights workers who were abducted and murdered. They were shot at close range and eventually buried in a landfill where they weren't found for 2 more months. Their names were Andrew Goodman, Michael or Mickey Schwerner, and James Chaney. I bet they are familiar names to a lot of you. What they had been doing was working in a project called the Freedom Summer Campaign, attempting to register African Americans in the southern states to vote. This registration effort was a part of a contesting of over 70 years of laws and practices that had systematically prevented blacks from voting and enjoying other freedoms equally with the rest of us. The 3 young men had been stopped for speeding, arrested, put in jail for a few days, then released and sent on their way. They got in their car and headed north. But behind them was law enforcement officers still, and others, and before leaving the county, their car was pulled over, they were abducted, and as I said, went through the experience of being shot at close range. Now, let me turn to the small role that Becky and I played in the Freedom Summer that was really generated, our roles were generated largely by the death of those 3 folks. And I stress the words small role because I want to emphasize that the civil rights battle in the 60s was, if I could use a metaphor, it was like a major drama being played out on a huge stage in the southern states. And as I learned this morning, maybe that should have been extended to Dahlonega Square. There are many people who had leading roles in that major drama. We already heard this morning the words of John Lewis. My personal hero, Martin Luther King Jr., is clearly the best known of this group of leading actors. Their courage stands out among others inasmuch as they were so visible and so vulnerable. Then there were many significant supporting actors. I include the full-time COFO workers, I'll come back to that in a moment, COFO workers in Mississippi. They were indispensable to the plot of this major drama, and they too surely had the courage of their convictions, not only for a week or so, but for years at a time. And of course, most importantly were the victims, those countless African Americans who were victimized by the evil, racist white society into which African Americans were introduced originally in chains against their will in an earlier generation, but who by 1964, without chains, were still held captive in a vicious Jim Crow society. Their courage was that of simply staying alive and surviving in a hostile environment. And some of them even stepped forward to resist their oppressors. If you were viewing this major drama from afar, those folks I just mentioned are the ones you would actually see on the stage. They're the ones who personify courage to me. And they're the ones that I want to lift up this morning as exhibiting unbelievable courage in very dangerous circumstances. Becky and I were among what I call the bit players. We were in the background. You wouldn't have even seen us probably on the stage. They and we played a small role who may have summoned up enough courage to get them through a week or more, but who shouldn't really be mentioned in the same breath with those major and supporting actors. I'd guess if you added up the bit players' contributions in total, they would have been helpful. But let me now turn to the specific things that Becky and I were involved in for the week or so that we were there. The Freedom Summer campaign of '64 wasn't received cordially, to put it mildly, by the southern states. Instead, it was a summer of extreme violence, highlighted best by the murder of Goodman and Schwerner and James Trainey. The violence was so extreme that COFO called for help from the National Council of Churches. COFO, which meant Council for Federated Organizations, was an umbrella agency under which all the other civil rights groups worked, including SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who, at least in Mississippi, provided most of the full-time staffing. They were the ones with whom we related while we were there. The National Council of Churches responded in short order by pledging at least 26 ministers per week in the town of Macomb, where we were stationed, and at least 6 of those ministers per week came from the Presbyterian Church, of which we were affiliated at the time. Becky chose to go as well. An aside about that, in all the publicity in the Harrisburg newspapers following my arrest, one sentence stands out for me. Quote, Mrs. Custis accompanied her husband, the pastor said, that was the pastor of the church on which I was on the staff. She accompanied her husband because she was fearful for his welfare. Now, don't you think that every husband should be lucky enough to have a woman who won't let anyone mess with her man? But better than that, Becky shared the same values that gave both of us the courage of our convictions to go to Mississippi, which was a fearful place, if you were at least on the side of COFO. So let me tell you the highlights of these two bit players in the major drama of '64 in Mississippi. We and two other ministers set out in our cars on Monday, October 19th for Mississippi. We left early in the morning in order to be at our destination before dark, since out-of-state license plates in those days made law enforcement officers suspicious of your intentions. We went directly to an orientation session in Magnolia, which is right down the road from Macomb. It's in the county, it's in Pike County, which someone has described as the lawless southwest side or corner of Mississippi. They introduced us to what we would be doing. We'd be doing voter registration work. More on that later. We would serve as liaisons between the black community and the COFO workers to help them spot needs of the people that we met in the community during our stay. The next thing was simply by being there, it was thought that by the presence of white clergy from around the country would generate more national publicity and therefore suppress the violence, since the locals didn't want any more bad publicity that they had gotten a lot of after the murder of the three workers. And again, simply by being there and interacting with the local blacks, it was hoped that we could bring some degree of encouragement and hope for them to cope with living in such a hostile environment. In that orientation session, there was one particular segment that dealt with security and self-preservation. That gets your attention. They told us how to behave if we were stopped by police. And remember, they said you can be arrested if the officer simply has a headache. They told us you could be arrested, dropped off somewhere where you'd get beat up, and then rearrested for disturbing the peace. They informed us that in the eyes of the locals, we are automatically communists. That was a big thing in the 60s, as you may remember. And working for a communist organization. You're suspected of being there to promote interracial marriage. We also learned that many local whites who had moderate points of view were themselves suspect, and several had been driven out of the community or pressured to leave. It was clear that we were entering a different world from that which we left in Pennsylvania, one in which we were only safe in the black community, and that if we entered the white community for any reason at all, we would not be safe. Quite an inversion of what your values and practices, I should say, were before. So you can understand that we had some apprehension. After the orientation session, Becky and I were dropped off at the home of a local black couple in Macomb who were to be our hosts for the first part of the week. We learned that their home was one of 16 residences and churches that had been bombed with dynamite in very recent weeks. One semi-humorous memory is that Becky and I were staying in the front corner bedroom of the house, which is the very area of the house that had been dynamited not long before. Just a little more apprehension. Wednesday and Thursday of the week we spent going door to door to try to get as many people as we could to register in the Freedom Democratic Party. You may remember that name, where they actually got people acknowledged as delegates in the National Democratic Convention, which was a big deal. And also to get people to be a part of the voting registration. We were encouraging people to come to what was called Freedom Day, a day in which white ministers would accompany local blacks to the courthouse in Magnolia in order for them to try to register to vote. As we did our door-to-door canvassing, we found that, and this is still indelibly impressed in my memory, we found that visiting with these folks in their homes and hearing many of them say that they were all for us, they supported us, they were praying for us, but they were too scared to even go down to the courthouse and try to vote, to register. And on Friday, the excitement began. The bombers who had been arrested for those dynamite bombings, 16 of them, were released on that day with suspended sentences. Mass arrests of COFO workers took place, though not yet of me. We and others of the ministers' group, Becky and I, had been taken to the Freedom House, the COFO headquarters, for our protection. Tension increased as the police were obviously trying to stop the Freedom Rally Sunday night and the Freedom Day on Monday. In fact, that night, the first night we were at the Freedom House, the police came to that Freedom House in the middle of the night in order to arrest us and the other ministers there. But the COFO workers were savvy enough to demand a search warrant. The police didn't have one, and they were turned away. But the COFO workers, after that, kept an all-night armed guard in the perimeter of the Freedom House in 2-hour shifts to deter any threats to the house itself or to its occupants. I don't want to think about what could have happened had the police taken us out of there in the middle of the night. One couldn't slip a sheet of paper between the police, the White Citizens Council, and the Ku Klux Klan. So that night, apprehension morphed into fear. Sunday night, the Freedom Rally was held. That was some 250 local blacks and 10 or so white ministers and a wife, singing "Oh Freedom" for it seemed like 20 minutes or so. It was thrilling. Then the speeches. Then came Freedom Day on Monday, when ministers accompanied local blacks to the courthouse to register. The first carload was arrested. Every carload was arrested. I was arrested. The courage of those local blacks were astounding. For while we were leaving in a few days, they had to stay in Macomb, live there, and face whatever repercussions might come their way from a resentful white population. Ministers were crowded into a cell that one of them surmised was the drunk tank. Just a bare cell with benches built around the sides. The rest of us, of course, didn't know what a drunk tank looked like, but we bought his story. As you might surmise, the jail cells were themselves segregated, so we wouldn't see the blacks who we had accompanied to vote until the next morning in the courthouse. My notes indicated that as we approached the courtroom, there was a sign, "Sheriff's Office, white entrance." And around the corner, "Sheriff's Office, colored entrance." My notes of the court session indicated that the local whites were sitting on the left side of the courtroom, glaring across the aisle to those of us who were sitting on the other side, the white ministers and the blacks who accompanied us as we sought to have them registered. The blacks told us that glaring, steady glaring, was what they called a hate stare. The lady from the court took pictures only of our side of the courtroom. I've often wondered what happened to those pictures. I really wish I had a copy of them. And oh yes, we were all found culpable, of course, and a date was set for a trial. Our bail was posted and we were released that day, as most of us apparently found friends out there to post that $100. And then all of us gathered at the Sweet Home Baptist Church. I'll never forget that. Singing and preaching. Not this kind of preaching, the preaching that brings you to your feet, people waving. I mean, it was amazing. Well, were we successful? No one was registered on Freedom Day. But I learned in a couple of weeks that COFO lawyers had been successful in securing a continuance on our trial, that one of the charges against us, trespassing on public property, was dropped. Later, all the charges were dropped. A temporary restraining order had been secured, which was directed against the county sheriff making any more arrests of those attempting to register. I don't know if I ever heard for sure, but they thought a permanent injunction would follow. If it did, that would have been the first really significant step in Pike County toward those blacks gaining some freedom. It had nothing to do directly with Becky and me being there. Remember, we had a small role, a bit part. But everything to do with the larger drama that was played out on this huge civil rights stage in Mississippi. Especially the leaders, Martin Luther King, John Lewis, and others. The support cast of full-time civil rights workers, and the very courageous blacks who stood up for their rights against tremendous odds. We bit players who found the courage of our convictions for a week, taken all together, hopefully were helpful as well. A postlude to the story. When we got back to Pennsylvania, we found out that I was one controversial fellow for having been arrested. Front page headlines in a major Harrisburg newspaper, who had called a local jailer in Mississippi to try to find out where I was, and you know what kind of cooperation he would get back. Never heard of me. So the headline was, "Area Pastor Disappears in Mississippi." That was rather silly. Everybody knew where I was down there. But that started a chain of events that eventually caused the church where I was working to show that they had courage of a different conviction when they fired me from my very first church job in slightly less than 1 year. And Becky at that time was pregnant with our first child. And she was really upset with that church. Probably more so than anything that happened in Mississippi. She coined a phrase that I love. Those people aren't the church, she said. They play church.
Amen.
I want to finish with a little vignette of courage that impressed me more than any others, that inspired me. On Thursday of that week before Freedom Day, another white minister and I were walking down a dusty dirt road going door to door to promote all of the activities that we were trying to get them involved in. On the opposite side of the road, going the other way, were 6 or 7 little black girls going home from school for lunch, I suppose. They didn't know that we were COFO workers. They just saw us as 2 white guys in their community. As they marched along the other side of the road, they looked at us as defiantly as you can imagine and sang at the top of their lungs the refrain of the song, "Oh Freedom." Before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. and go home to my Lord and be free. It really made me want to make it possible for them not to have to go to their graves to be free. And I hope that that story will help all of us to continue having the courage of our strongly held convictions, whatever they may be, in whatever field or cause they may be. And I must say, one thing I love about being a part of this church is I already know that that is true of almost, not almost, of all of us. Amen.